morning, welcome back. This is Daybreak and thank you for staying with us. The hashtag on X is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Now we talk about the road to the United Arab Emirates for the COP28 climate conference, coming against the backdrop of the Nairobi Climate Summit, in which the African governments and heads of governments and prime ministers congregated here in Nairobi with a communique. We'll be talking much more about that and how the resolutions will be a part of what will inform the debates and the talks at the United Arab Emirates, in the United Arab Emirates for the COP28 climate conference, and also 1 year after the COP20, the other climate conference which happened in the Egyptian city of Sharm el-Sheikh and preceded that by the Glasgow Climate Conference in 2021. With me in studio is Nasra Nanda. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Green Building Society that focuses on cities and planning, and also largely commentates on climate affairs in the country. Thanks, Nasra, for making time for the broadcast.
Thank you to you.
Well, let's begin with one of the major outcomes of the Nairobi Climate Conference, which you were largely a party to. I mean, talk to us about how the final outcome of the Nairobi Climate Summit will inform much of Africa and Kenya's position by extension at the COP28 Climate Conference.
Thank you. So I think the first thing I want to highlight is that the Nairobi Declaration was essentially the very first time that Africa came together to decide what Africa's narrative in the climate conversation will be. For this reason, that in itself is historic, because it was the first time the region met to discuss climate issues from a region's perspective. However, I think, you know, insofar as the nature of the summit itself was historic, we still have a long way to go insofar as we've come together as Africa. We've highlighted some of our priorities. We've missed some key ones. What I would like to see, you know, from the Climate Action Summit's declaration onto COP is specific priorities from each sector that we're hoping to negotiate as Africa, and then on our part as Kenya as well, so that as we go into COP, we're negotiating from a perspective that these are our problems as Africa that we've prioritized, and this is what we need in terms of funding going into COP and the assistance, whether it's technical or otherwise. So in that regard, the declaration was important. Of course, there were hits and misses, but let's take it from there.
And when you talk about the continental call to climate action, we have largely seen in the previous COPs in Glasgow in 2021 and in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in 2022 of separate countries and largely affected by the climate consequences, Africa by extension, largely the southern hemisphere of the world. How does then this continental call as one block from the entire continent be a call that will, I mean, sort of prompt action in terms of financing mitigation measures of climate consequences from the big polluters, for example, into COP28?
So in my view, I think when you are a bloc, of course, you have a stronger voice, because with Africa, you're looking at around 50 countries or 57 countries coming together. That means even how you negotiate from a stronger position rather than one country seeking assistance. By bringing this block of countries together, you can agree on the common issues that unite you as Africa. And second, there was the issue around a new financial architecture that President Ruto talked about. So African countries are saying we're the least responsible for climate change, yet we need the most in terms of technical and financial support. Doing it alone is much harder. So I'm hoping that with this block, there'll be, one, a stronger common position. That means even as you're going into these spaces, how you negotiate is from a better position, because you are united in one common voice. And
that is the point. I mean, when you mention the call to climate action and the financing aspect that the head of state talked about, and passionately so, what we saw with the last outcomes of the COPs largely, and the Glasgow conference in 2021 in the United Kingdom, was largely an agreement in which the big polluters were hesitant to put pen to. And an agreement largely which in the aftermath, even after convincing parties, was lacked teeth. I mean, there were no mechanisms. I mean, are we likely to see a situation as such when a continental bloc like Africa will pressure the big polluters to commit to financing of climate consequences, of non-committal on their end as well, as we head into Abu Dhabi for the COP28 climate conference?
So I think the difference between the previous COPs and this COP is that previously African heads of state were not united in their approach. So COP27 and before that, each country was more or less saying we're African suffering, but there was no united voice. This COP, I'm hoping, takes with it a few different developments. Now, number one, African states are arguing as Africa, so that's a key significant change. And two, we also had a platform through the Africa Climate Summit where we are saying we will agree on what our priorities are as Africa, and we're then taking that into COP. So I'm hoping with those two changes, the global north will start seeing that Africa is now moving away from waiting for the global north to set the priorities. The only thing I would like to say as a disclaimer is that we need to be prepared, not just coming together, but preparations means we need to be clear on our priorities. And then second, in the event the global north does not give us what we're seeking for, what is our alternative solution locally or regionally for us to now prepare and tackle climate change?
On locally, we will talk about that because, and I'm sure this was a very summit that you closely followed of the Devolution Conference, 7th annual in Makwene County in 2021, a multi-level governance for climate action at the counties for the devolving to put in some funds for a case of climate budget that they ought to be having, and also the focus on climate action and the lots that need to be done here locally. But this happening in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, and we have seen flooding. I mean, and you commented as such on planning and green energy. Talk to me about the irony of Dubai hosting the climate conference, which will bring world leaders together, yet it's flooding to an extent that the climate consequence is virtually in action at the very same place that is supposed to be hosting the climate conference.
So I'd like to say that I see it differently. I actually think it's a blessing that the floods are happening during COP, because maybe the people who think it's Africa's problem or Asia's problem, not a global north problem, are going to be experiencing climate change in action as they discuss climate action. So I think that's going to be a very strong wake-up call to a lot of leaders who are now going to a city which is experiencing it as they discuss it. Perhaps it might work to our benefit because now we're seeing that even Dubai, which is glamorous and seen as the gateway to a lot of opportunity, is not immune to this. So the approach that it is a region's problem, not all of our problems, has been disrupted. And so for me, I think it's an amazing opportunity for us to say, we're not complaining as Africa because we're here to beg. No, this is all our problems. We just need support in walking this journey.
And how prominent will that then feature when you look at it from the perspective of what's happening in the United Arab Emirates at the moment? We have seen floods in most parts of Europe. We have seen also island nations like the Bahamas in the Caribbean, which will be underwater if the global temperatures continue to rise. We have seen extreme droughts in the African continent. And now the other extreme end, which is now flooding, for example, what we have in Kenya, we'll talk about. Will these factors be given prominence? Do you think there will be consensus in the end? And will these issues inform a cohesive outcome from the COP28?
I definitely believe that there will be significant traction, if not outcomes, because of now these things happening right now as we're discussing COP. And that's just human nature. Once we see it, now we start to be affected by it in a more a prominent manner. What I will say is, firstly, I think out of COP and going into COP, what is going to be key is that now governments will see the need of setting aside budget specifically for disaster preparation, mitigation and adaptation. And I would like to hope that in our local context in Kenya, that now the national government will see and hopefully work with county governments to support that aspect when it comes to dealing with climate-related issues. Because as you rightly pointed out now, between the Asal region and the other regions within the country, it's extreme. Where it's drought, people are dying and starving. When it's flash floods, roads are being swept away. This should not be a priority when it's happening. The government needs to be prepared before by doing mapping of drought and flooding assessments, monitoring the situation. And I know that Kenya Meteorological Department did some preparation around it, but preparation is not enough. We need to make sure that this is captured so that the government can, prioritize a budget around that as well.
And getting back, because what we talked about largely was the Nairobi Declaration and the alternative that you talked about in the event the big polluters would still hold on to the cash that's meant to forestall the consequences of climate change. What then is our alternative? What then is Africa's alternative back in the continent in the event the current clarion call from the continent is not heeded by the big polluters?
I think the first thing we need to do then is incorporate community-based organizations and the local communities in understanding how they are affected by climate. Then, as African states, we need to now look at local funding sources. Like in Kenya, for example, pension funds are locally available funding sources. That could be a solution, at least in the short to medium term, to seeing how we can come up with local solutions through local funding resources. I think in the past, a lot of African or developing country governments have over-relied on foreign goodwill. And also, the government needs to come up with its own plan. How do you raise funds locally to address these issues? We cannot be relying on external sources. The people of Kenya did not vote for external sources. They voted for their president and their local leaders. Exactly. Okay.
We'll talk about that caching aspect and also tying it up with the conference which happened in Makueni in the year 2021. And interestingly so, at the time, when it's the same time, just some few days when the COP climate conference ended in Glasgow in the United Kingdom, as we take stock of the road to COP28 climate conference in the United Arab Emirates and the continental call for climate action, which appears to be the message Africa will carry into the United Arab Emirates ahead of the climate conference that will be happening from the 4th from December. That is in December this year. That is next month in the United Arab Emirates, as the world congregates in the United Arab Emirates for what appears to be the call by the international community to forestall the consequences of climate change globally. The hashtag on X is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdulkadir. We are back with more after the break. Stay tuned.